Would you explain your example of voters who were more likely to vote for George W. Bush when they were ovulating? Because that one is now going to be my go-to example of that sort of sociological meets poli-sci problem that when you read something, really ask yourself whether that makes any freaking sense.
I will say the fact that you're thinking this much about George W. Bush in 2024 is like kind of, I mean, I guess it's because it's a home book, but it's...
I'm longing for the days when our choices were George Bush and Al Gore.
So here's the thing. First of all, I'm not going to weigh in on the current state of academic economics, like social psychology, et cetera, even though you asked me to, because because those aren't my fields. And like, I'm not qualified to like weigh in on that. I will say, certainly what I wrote in 2014 about this, and what we're going to say for those who are not in depth down with like, issues in like social psychology methodology, like I'm going to say what p-hacking is in a second, but like, I do think people, I was writing about something I think is a problem, but not something I think is like a decisive problem that kills an entire field of inquiry. And I do think some people read it that way, and that I'm not really on board with. I think like the world is filled with scientists who are basically trying to do sound work, and mostly they do. And like, we should push back on like methodological problems that we find, but that's not to indict an entire field of study. But what does happen is that, we have this somewhat weird system that a statistician named Ronald Fisher kind of accidentally invented like in the 1930s, where we use what's called a p-value to assess how impressive the results of a study are. And you've probably seen, if you ever have read a study, you've probably seen the word significant or statistically significant to refer to the results of a study. And this is in some sense, like this word choice is somehow the original sin, because that word, it refers to sort of a certain mathematical criterion, but the English word significant means like important, right? Like that's absolutely not what the word significance means in a statistical sense. It's like nothing like that. At best, maybe we should have used a word like detectable or noticeable or something like that. Like a very, very small effect that is insignificant in any ordinary English sense would be significant in the statistical sense. And that leads to an immense amount of confusion. Although, I mean, but even detectable is like a little bit too strong, because really what we're saying, and when I say this, you're going to be like, but why would you measure that? Well, it's because it's what we can measure. When we compute a p-value, what we're reporting is if ovulation had no effect, how much you were a devotee of compassionate conservatism, 1,000 points of light, the Midland Odessa oil industry, Yale College, like whatever, like, and wanted to vote for George W. Bush. Like if it were not the case that your kind of hormonal flood with ovulation affected your affinity for all those things, how likely would it be that we would see the results of this survey or poll that we did? And what they found is that, it was like pretty unlikely, like less than 1 in 20. But that's like a weird thought experiment, right? That's not saying like, what is the chance that ovulation doesn't affect your propensity to vote for George W. Bush? It's saying in this world, which might or might not be the world we live in, where there's no effect, how likely would it be that the results of this experiment were what they were? Which is a weird question, because the results of the experiment were what they were. That's not actually what's in question. We're asking about what the world is like. That's kind of a funny thing to ask. And there's a whole story, which I won't try to tell in podcast form, but I tell it in the book, of like, how did that become the kind of standard by which scientific studies are based? And by the way, I'm not necessarily against it. I think the people who devised it understood very well what kind of mechanism it was, because it was not ever meant to be a mechanism for figuring out what's the truth. It's a mechanism for deciding